welcome back to episode number 30 of Inside the Vault, a Carolina Panthers podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Smith. This podcast is brought to you by the Keep Pounding Podcast Network on Twitter at KP_FSSN. And this podcast is powered by the Fans First Sports Network. Follow them on Twitter at FansFirstSN. Well, my latest guest today here on Inside the Vault, he is a writer at The Athletic, 2000 NFL Executive of the Year, former executive for the Seahawks and Chargers, and also general manager for the Saints and Dolphins as well. You can follow him on Twitter at Randy Mueller _. And welcome to the podcast, Randy Mueller. Randy, how's it going?
Doing great, Ryan. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to chopping it up with you a little bit.
Yeah, let's get into it. If you followed my podcast or listened to a few episodes, the first question I've asked everyone so far is just give me your brief 4,000-foot view on just the past 2-15 season from the Panthers. Not a lot to be excited about, but just what were your overall takeaways from this past season for Carolina? And then we'll get into some of the things that we've done in the offseason so far.
Well, I think from, like you said, 30,000 feet, it obviously hasn't been pretty. I think there's been a lot of impulse. There's been a lot of reactionary things that I wish they would have more poise and more patience with, but that's part of the NFL, right? Everybody wants answers right away. I do think any franchise starts with the owner, and I know David Tepper's been picked on probably more than most the last 6 or 8 months, especially, but
Yeah,
I get it. It's hard to overcome impulsive owners for sure. I've been there. I've done that. I've worked with new owners. I was in charge of the Seahawks when Paul Allen bought the team. But I'll say this, the best thing Paul Allen ever did was give me a license to do my job. And I like to be tested by ownership for sure. And he tested me on a lot of things. So I think input is good. But I think he also understood what he didn't know and trusted me to make some decisions that he wasn't qualified himself to make. So I've been with new owners, and that can be a slippery slope. So it seems like from a long ways away, that relationship is still working its way out. And hopefully for Panther fans, they see some don't see history repeating itself again. That's for sure.
Yeah. Before we get into specifically the offseason, let's talk about, just Dave Canales, now the new head coach, 7th in Panthers history. He's got some history with Baker last year in Tampa, Russell Wilson, and Geno Smith in Seattle. Energy, charisma, a football IQ. And then you got Dan Morgan, former Panther, cut his teeth with Seahawks, actually, and then Buffalo, and then down here in Carolina. So what are your thoughts on those hires specifically, and what do you know about them?
Well, I don't know Dave. I have heard a lot of good things about him, though. Obviously, I spent 20 years with the Seahawks, and a lot of people that I grew up with are still there, and I can't find anybody that would say anything negative about Dave. So I think his reputation preceded him. He's a good fit. He's a good team guy. I think he's a consensus builder, but he can come down when he needs to be authoritative. I've known Dan a little longer. I've been able to have visits with him throughout his time in Seattle, and then even in Buffalo and Carolina. What do they say? Once a player, always a player. So Dan is eager to get involved, eager to be in the middle of deals, which I think is good. He's got a tough spot in that he's kind of stuck between the coach and the owner. And so he's got to be the referee, I would think, sometimes, but he's got a pretty good demeanor for that. Obviously, he's grown up around the game and being a first-round pick himself. He's been represented by a good friend of mine, Tom Condon, for years. And so I've known about Dan since his early time in Miami. So I think he has the basis for doing the job. I don't know how much he's allowed to do, so I don't know the specifics behind the position he has right now.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let's get into the offseason a little bit and kind of what the Panthers have done so far, and I'll kind of recap it for Panther fans or anyone who've been living under a rock since the start of free agency. But the biggest news we'll start with is the Panthers traded Brian Burns, who then landed a 5-year deal, $150 million with $87.5 million guaranteed with the New York Giants. And then Panthers got pick 39 and swapped 5th rounders next year. But Burns is now the 2nd highest paid defensive end in the NFL. If you were running the Panthers, obviously the Panthers need picks. Was this a good move or not to trade him away, in your opinion? And is Burns worth 30 million a year? Because we were told that Panthers offered 27. He said he wanted to be closer to 30, but not necessarily right at 30. He said no to 27. What are your thoughts on the trade and what the Giants paid for?
Well, I would say this about Burns and kind of my philosophy in running these football teams is I do not like to see good players get out the door. So if it meant paying another million or million and a half or meeting in the middle, I surely would have erred on the side of I want to keep good players.
Mm-hmm.
The draft picks that they got, I mean, it's been documented that it's not what they were once offered. That's a tough pill to swallow if you're me. I don't understand why they would do that for that amount. I happened to do a free agent list for the Athletic just
Yep.
last month, and he was the top guy on my list. I don't think the sacks came easy for him being in the defense he was in, so maybe they could justify paying him a little less. But I saw Brian Burns as a skilled guy that makes a difference, that can really be hard to block, and that offenses have to game plan for. So I think the Giants were able to get him for a little bit of compensation, not what he's worth for sure. Whatever they paid him, I understand it. I get it. I think he's a difference maker. And so if the balance was another million or two per se, I couldn't really draw a line in the sand and say we're not going to do it. So I
Yeah.
struggle with the move. I understand why they did it. They probably don't think they're that guy away from being good, but I tell you what, there's several choices away from reciprocating what his value was. And so you can say we're looking for draft picks. I get it. Good luck trying to find another Brian Burns.
Well, that is what the draft is for. You just never know. We've seen guys hit first round, third round, fourth round. You just never know. Panthers are hosting defensive ends, Jadeveon Clowney, Chase Young, who left without a deal today, and then DJ Wanham, who the Panthers did sign 2 years, 12.5 million. Obviously, he's someone who's not Brian Burns. We know that he had 8 sacks last year as well. For Panther fans out there, do you think, let's say the Panthers signed him tonight. Let's just say that were to happen. Does Clowney on one side and DJ on the other side, does that together, if they gel together, does that help the Panthers offset the loss of Brian Burns, or is it not enough?
Well, I think it helps without a doubt. I think they need players. They need multiple players, and that may have went into their decision to let Brian Burns go. I like DJ Wanham. He's made 8 sacks. You said he's done that twice in his 4 years with Minnesota. So he's a productive player that I don't think he hurts him by any means. Clowney is a little bit of a different puzzle to solve because he's been with 4 or 5 teams. He really never cut it loose until last year being in
Right.
Baltimore with Mike McDonald and what became the best defense in the league. So he's found a little home in a scheme that he was able to produce in. He's never been a sack producer. So I don't know that he's going to help him get sacks in a defense that he may or may not be able to adjust to right away. Chase Young, I think, can sack the quarterback, but everybody says maybe you give him a pillow deal or a 1-year deal, prove it, because he's kind of underachieved in his other spots. He had a 1-year deal with San Francisco. In fact, he had an 8-week deal with San Francisco.
Right.
And that kind of went, so. He kind of underachieved there. And we all know about the video that went viral about him not pursuing at 100%. And that's a struggle for me. So I don't know that any of these guys are Brian Burns, but I do like the addition of Wanham. I guess if you gave me a choice, I might have to go with Clowney because I know his versatility and I know he can fill 2 or 3 different alignment spots. So maybe that works. But his swing and miss rate has been, he's been 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 in his prior stops. So you got to hope to get the best out of him for sure. Don't forget, Clowney was on the street last year, I believe, until mid-August or so before the Ravens signed him. So he's in a little different spot now, and that he's earned some money and might get paid sooner than later.
Yeah. That's good analysis there. Let's move to specifically other besides the defensive end. Panthers also lost Frankie Louvu to the Commanders, Jeremy Chin also to the Commanders, and then Yetur Gross-Matos to the 49ers. Those are probably the biggest losses for the Panthers in free agency. And then going to who we signed, Panthers signed a variety of people. Robert Hunt from the Dolphins was our first one, 100 million, 5 years, 63 guaranteed. Hunt is a big man, 6'6", 330 pounds for the Dolphins, going to play right guard for the Panthers. And then Damian Lewis, who will be playing left guard, 4 years, 53 million. Started 61 games over 4 years with the Seahawks. Thoughts on the offensive line, those two signings specifically, and that protection for Bryce Young? It seems like Panthers are modeling that New Orleans Saints philosophy where you get the guard play and up in those passing lanes will be able to open for Bryce down the field.
Well, I don't think they have any choice. I think they have to do that. I think whether they overpaid to get him or not, that's going to be debatable. But the one skill set that they need, if they're going to build this thing with Bryce Young, is they can't allow the pocket to be collapsed in front of him. When
Yep.
you're frame challenged, height challenged, vision challenged like Bryce Young, you cannot allow penetration up the gut because that'll kill you. And you mentioned the Saints. They did the same thing when they had Drew Brees. Drew Brees was 6 foot tall and a little different passer, obviously, than where Bryce Young is at this point.
Yep.
But I give him an A for effort. They're trying to firm up the middle. I don't know that they're getting great players, but they do solve the we're giving pressure up the gut dilemma if that's what they want to do. I don't think either are very athletic, and both these guards are going to be, if their downhill running game is what we're going to do from a running standpoint, then maybe they're a good fit. But I know Damian Lewis in Seattle didn't have a great year this year. They kind of were willing to move on from him. And I worry a little bit about Hunt's durability, his fitness, 330 pounds. And we've heard the cry out of Miami for the last couple of years that offensive line needs to be better as well. So we'll see. I do think they've solved an issue in that they can stop the leakage up the middle. The guys that you mentioned exiting, I think probably more national people struggle with Ryan as to what the plan is when you do see Jeremy Chin leave, when you see Frank Aluva leave. These guys were really productive for Carolina, and I think will be really good players, actually, both for Washington now, which sounds crazy. But I think that's where people start to question, what are the Panthers doing? They're letting good players go. So they have let 3 good players go on defense. Maybe they've helped themselves a little bit in the interior of their offensive line. I think they still have a lot of work to do to be competitive for sure.
Yeah. And then on defense, Ashawn Robinson, we signed 3 years, $22.5 million deal. He has 110 games with 74 starts in the league. Josie Jewell, linebacker from the Denver Broncos, 3 years, $7.5 million deal. And then Dane Jackson from the Bills, just yesterday, 2 years, $8.5 million, 5.1 guaranteed, 28 games started in 4 years with the Bills. Cornerback for them. Talk about the defensive signings. Ashawn Robinson, I think, could fit nicely next to Derek Brown, who is quietly one, I think, top 10 in the league, maybe top 5 defensive tackles in the league, in my opinion. Josie Jewell, I think, fits nicely where Luvu is. He is definitely not Frankie Luvu, but I think he's a really good replacement. And then Dane Jackson, I think, could fit where CJ Henderson was for the Panthers this past year, corner number 3 position. But based on what his contract says, that could be starter money at corner 2. So what are your thoughts on those defensive signings?
Well, I like the additions. I'm agreeing with you in that Deshaun Robinson's a really big dude inside who we need to play the run. He's a first and second down run defender. He will bring the physicality up at that level. And you're right, next to Brown, I think they could be a formidable pair in there. So I like that. I'm with you on Jackson too, the corner they signed from Buffalo. This guy has a knack for making plays. He's very athletic. And I think when the opportunities expand, you're going to see a playmaking guy who has a knack for timing and playing the ball. That's really what I saw when I watched the tape on him. A really good knack for when to break up balls and how to break them up without getting pass interference. And he's athletic. He can run with guys and cover them. So an instinctive player. Josie Jewell, I'm okay with that. I think you're right. Here's a guy that plays with instincts. He plays with anticipation. He's really got a high football IQ. He will get everybody lined up. But I think you're correct in saying he's not going to run like Frankie Luvu. He's not going to have that same range. So they give up maybe a little bit of range. They add some football moxie and some ability to keep the guys lined up correctly. And there will be value that people like about Josie Jewell, that's for sure. He's production-based, mainly because of work ethic and instincts and anticipation.
Yeah. And then before we get into some non-free agency and then get your predictions and get you out of here, I we remiss if I did not mention Deontay Johnson, the Steelers receiver who the Panthers traded for, sent Dante Jackson to Pittsburgh for really a bag of peanuts, I would say, is what we got Deontay Johnson for. So obviously he's had some baggage. There's been good and there's been
Yeah.
bad in Pittsburgh. So what is your thoughts on Deontay Johnson coming to Carolina? As of now, I'd say he's Bryce's number one target.
Wow, that's crazy. Um, I did get a chance to look at some film on him this year, especially, and in fact, looked at some more this morning after the deal went down. Extremely talented, athletic, can be explosive at times, can really put his foot in the ground when he does. He's not a detailed route runner, though. And I think a lot of times there's some hesitation to his game where he's not sure where to go and when to go against zone coverages. I think probably everybody's waiting for Deontay Johnson to break out, and it just hasn't happened. So I would say there's been some underachieving without a doubt. I think the biggest disappointment I saw, and I'm not beating him up because I think he does fit with what they need and is in the grade, he struggled to make contested catches. In other words, when he's covered, it's a 50-50 chance if he's going to come up with it just because he's not physical. He's a finesse guy who does run fast.
Yeah.
The problem is they cover you in this league. Defensive backs are good. They play with physicality. They allow some of that at the NFL level. And he's just never been able to fight through that to make plays at the ball when he's really contested. So those are things he needs to work on for sure.
In the draft, switching gears for just a second, we go to the draft. Panthers' first three picks, our first two picks are in the second round, 33 and 39. 33 is like a first round pick. Obviously, we would be picking number one, except for that trade with Bryce Young. So obviously, Chicago is picking there. For the sake of time, I won't ask you player specifically to target, but what needs do you think the Panthers should go for in these first two picks at 33 and 39?
Well, I'll tell you a couple things. Picking 33, my guess is that the Panthers, if they end up staying at 33, will get a player on their front board that's ranked probably in the top 20, 23 maybe, because nobody stacks their boards the same. So if they can line up 20 names, they have a good chance to get one of them, maybe 25 at the most, but they'll get somebody good out of that. So I don't think they need to mess around with that pick. I think they will get a first round pick off their board at that spot. What it ends up being, here's my theory on that. They have a lot of needs. They should take the highest player rated on their board, regardless of filling a need. They need players everywhere. So to bypass better players at a graded level to take something that you may have a bigger need for is how teams get in trouble. So if they can fill a few needs between now and then still, and there's still plenty of value in free agency, but if they can check some boxes between now and the draft, it will give Dan Morgan a chance to just sit tight and draft the best player available. That would be the advice I would have for Dan. Don't reach to grab needs with those first two picks.
Are the Panthers finally? I asked this question kind of in jest. A lot of fans thought the Panthers were kind of deceived the last few years. You know, Fitterer, Matt Rule, we can go down the line. You know, the Panthers didn't really embrace a true rebuild. It was a bunch of band-aids on some gushing wounds. Are the Panthers finally embracing a true rebuild, kind of with what they've done so far in this free agency and kind of how Dave Canales and Dan Morgan are approaching this offseason?
Well, I think they're trying to. It's hard to embrace a full rebuild because you know what? The next guys will be coming in to rebuild in 2 years. So you do have to put a competitive team on the field. And that's the line in the sand, right? You want to rebuild, but at the same time, you've got to be competitive because as you know, you have an owner that is not very patient. And so we've got to see progress. I would think that has to enter into their equation. It's nice to say we're going to rebuild and everybody knows that. And so the expectations aren't great. But when you go 2-8, expectations change and evaluations change on the decision makers as well. So we'll see how that shakes out. I do think this, and I know I've known Scott Fitter forever. I think some of the issues that he had there are still there. And that makes it really hard to build a team with a systematic process. The one thing I would say is I never really knew the process and I never knew what the plan was. It seemed like it jumped around a lot. I would like to know and dissect a few of the decisions that were made over the last couple of years and figure out why and make sure we don't have a process in place that allows us to do the same thing again. Maybe they've done that internally. I don't know, but I would hope so for Panther fans' sake.
Yeah. Well, they can start by the two remaining players on defense, J.C. Horn and Derek Brown, who are probably the close to elite level. Obviously, re-signing those guys here coming up in the next few years. We'll see how that goes there. A couple of general questions regarding kind of your time in the NFL and kind of what you see now, and we'll get you out of here with some predictions. As I mentioned at the top of the show, your NFL experience. How has the NFL changed since you've been in a front office? What have you seen that's been changed now with the league?
Well, the biggest thing is the availability of players and the movement within rosters. It was for years rosters that were built and they stayed the same. But the two things that changed that were one, the salary cap, and two, free agency. And I was lucky enough to be involved when I was making decisions in Seattle. When those changes came to fruition, I was able to jump in, even as a young guy at 30 some years old, and have
Yeah.
the same level of experience as some of the old timers, the George Youngs, the Ron Wolfs, the Bobby Bethards. Those guys had no more experience dealing with the new systems than I did. So I had a great advantage, and I could jump in and really learn the cap from the ground up without having to forget the old stuff because I didn't know anything. I was young and at heart, and lucky for me, I had spent and got a job with the Seahawks right out of college. So I had spent 15 years doing things a certain way, but I could still adapt because I was young at heart. So I think
Yeah.
those are the big things. The way to run a team now, I think, has been made easier by the fact that you have so many ways to get players now. You have, and we're going through it today, yesterday, cap casualties. You have free agency. You have more teams willing to trade. Ron Wolf used to tell me on the phone when I was in charge in other places, he'd say, I'm going to call you, kid, because I know you'll trade. For years, trades were hard to come by, but now you see people willing to make deals and trade salaries. And there's just a lot more ways you can build your team. Sure, there are more ways to lose your team and lose your roster, but I think you embrace change more, and that makes it easier, I think, to build your team. And if you can evaluate and if you can value, which is two separate processes altogether,
Mm.
you can build teams because there are so many ways to do it nowadays, as opposed to, in the late 90s or even late 80s when I was in charge.
Yeah. Um, what is the biggest thing you learned working with Nick Saban?
Well, I'll say this. I had 25 years of experience in my back pocket when I went with Nick to Miami. And he was really the GM and the head coach, but I had the GM title. Nick
Sure.
was in charge. What I learned then is if you can have an open mind, no matter how long you've done things and how successful you've been in the past, if you have an open mind, you can do better at your job than you ever think. He made me so much better, Ryan, at my job after 25 years and building some playoff teams and winning some awards. He made me so much better at my job that I learned this, that just have an open mind and be willing to listen and somewhat embrace change. And you might be shocked at how good you can get at your job. So some of it he kind of beat into me, but a lot of
Yeah.
the time they say what doesn't kill you makes you better, right? And so
Right.
we had a
Yeah.
really good working relationship, and he made me really good at my job. I enjoyed my time with him as hard as it could have been a lot of days.
Yeah. Um, as we get you out the door here, Bryce Young, real quickly, what did you see from him coming out last year? And I'll kind of combine two questions into one. What is your to-do list if you were coaching Bryce Young or managing Bryce Young this offseason? What is his offseason to-do list?
Well, my evaluation of Bryce last year was different than most. I see the height being a challenging factor that's always be there. I didn't see the can't miss prospect. Now everybody can say, "Oh, that's hindsight 2020," but I think those that have followed the game and have been around it know what they're looking at. And I struggled to connect some of those dots with Bryce. Now that you have him, I think you've got to do a couple things. And one, they are trying to do by firming up the protections inside. I think the other thing you got to do is you got to install a running game that bails him out of a lot of pocket passing, having to hold the ball, because that's not going to be his thing. You're almost going to have to run a movement type, RPO type offense where he can get out on the edges and see things better and use some of his athleticism and ability to throw on the run. So you definitely have to, I think, install a little bit of a different offense, not as traditional as some of us have grown to and grew up with in the NFL. It's still challenging though from a vision standpoint. One thing that's helpful is I think your receivers and perimeter players are going to have to be really tall. They're going to have to be big because he's going to have to find them easier. And I
Yeah.
think it's hard for small guys to find small guys. So there's some nuances that are challenging. I think they're well aware of that though in Carolina, and they'll work to make life easier for Bryce for sure.
Yeah. Last three, and I'll get you out of here.
No
What would you
problem.
what would you say is the state of the Panthers? If someone said, Randy, what is the state of the Panthers at this moment? What would you say? Is it a, because fans don't want to hear, is it going to be 2026 when the Panthers are good again? 2025? Can they compete next year because the NFC South is so weak, despite Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta, coming off an Achilles? What is the state of the Panthers as you see?
Well, and again, I'm from 30,000 feet across the country, but I follow it close every day. And I see still a lot of chaos. I just don't see a plan that I can understand yet. So for me to criticize or to jump on board with, I just don't have enough information because from what I've seen, that plan keeps changing, right? There's a lot of, as they say on TV in the commercials, recalculating. There's a lot of recalculating going on. And at some point,
Yeah,
you've got to stay the course. And we all
sure.
have to understand what we're looking for and how we're going to do it. Now, I understand they may know that internally, and that's great. More power to them. But it seems to me like the targets have always been moving, whether it's, one day we hire Frank Reich, the next day we don't believe in him. We change coordinators, then we go back to Frank Reich. All these changes of philosophy and of vision, I just don't know what the vision is. I don't know what we want to be. So from that standpoint, it's a real unknown for me to put my finger on how I feel about the Carolina Panthers.
No, that's fair. And I think this hire with Canales, at the press conference, I think one of the reporters tried to ask Joe Person, actually at the Athletic, who's been on this podcast. I think he asked Dave, are you speaking today? And he said, I'm in the background now. I'm going to be hands off. And so I think that's what a lot of Panther fans are wanting to hear is they hope he stays in the background and, let the football people do the things that you hired them to do. I think that's what a lot of people, I think, would say. So,
Well, I would agree with that. I hope he can. I hope he can stay back, but I want him to also feel free that he's got to test these guys too. He can't just take everything they say with a grain of salt. He's got to be involved enough to listen and ask questions because I know this, and I'm not Dan Morgan, but I knew I didn't want to be the smartest guy in the room for my 30 years in the league. I always wanted people to ask questions and start discussions because that's only going to make us all better. At the end of the day, I'll gladly make the decision, but I want all the information I can. And if David Tepper can bring some things to the table to help in the process or to tighten down the process, that's beneficial for your GM without a doubt.
last two for you. What is the boldest prediction for the Panthers next year in 2024? It can be good, bad, something in between. What is your bold prediction for Carolina next season? What do you got for us?
Well, I think they've got a long ways to go, Ryan. I just don't know. I mean, everybody wants probably me to say, "Hey, playoff team, 10 wins." I don't know. They got to be better than they were last year. I'll say that. These rules and the directions that these teams
Can't go
can go
anywhere but
now,
up.
get you can get good in a hurry. So I would expect a bold prediction to be no more than 5 or 6 wins. If they can do that, they're showing progress, and God bless them because you got to crawl before you walk, right? And so
Yep.
those
Yep.
are all part of Dave Canales' first year, and it's going to be a long year. But at the same time, if they can win 5, 6 games, that's probably going to be considered progress.
Last one for you. Not where I thought I was going to be ending, but just where our conversation went to. I thought this would be just a good question. As right now we're in free agency. We just had a bunch of roster moves from all 32 teams. As fans follow the draft, the free agency time period, as a former general manager, as a former executive, can you just enlighten fans when contracts are signed? What is the difference when teams say cap we have to get under the cap or we're over the cap, versus cap versus cash. I think there's a very misunderstanding when it comes to, they released a player because of cap, salary cap, or no,
Right.
it was more cash. What do you got for us in that effort? As we're monitoring.
Well, yeah, the easiest way for me to describe it is everybody has their budgets at home, right? And they can pay cash for whatever thing they want to buy, and they can use a credit card for whatever they don't want to pay cash for. And that's the way these teams are run. A lot of teams are spending credit card and going past the limitations in hope that they can pay the bill before the bank knows they're over the limit. And so that's really what teams are doing, is they're trying to spread out their cash to make it, triple and sometimes quadruple in value, but eventually you have to pay the bill. So you can spread out your payments, but at some point you got to buy the house and keep making the payments every month. So that's really the biggest thing. Cash really isn't a problem for most NFL teams. Most NFL owners have it. If they don't, they borrow it. And even if they have it, they still borrow it. So cash is available, whether it's through TV contracts or through radio or season tickets. They have plenty of cash. So that's usually not a problem. Now, some teams are willing to spend more of it than others. And what cash does is cash allows you to purchase more. If you can supplement your cash and spread out your cap counts, because it's amortized over the length of these deals, that's how you can afford to get more players. And when I say afford, that's how you stretch your cap. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, Ryan, but you've got to be able to stretch that $250 million cap into maybe $350 million by using a credit card and cash together to make the cap counts allow you to have more players than anybody else.
And one additional question that I think just you made me think of right because of that is, well, is it because like, do some teams, you hear all the time, the teams that are all, it seems like some teams are always run better than other teams throughout the league. And I don't think that's a
Yeah.
coincidence. As a former executive, what is a dirty little secret that some of these listeners might be able to hang their hat on is, do some owners just want to collect a paycheck and the product on the field is not as good because they don't care, and some owners want to win, or is it not like that? Are we misunderstanding? What is it?
My answer is yes. I do think some owners want to win more than others. And nobody wants that to be out in the public's eye. But I've been with 4 different teams, and I know owners are all different. Some are willing to pay whatever it takes. Some are willing to get out of the way if that's what it takes. They'll do anything to win. Others, because a dollar saved is a dollar earned, they might want to keep that and keep you on a tighter budget. So there are pros and cons to all sides, but everybody's willingness to win that level is different. And organizations that I've been with are all different, depending on how much you're willing to change and make yourself uncomfortable. And sometimes that comes with spending money. But I'll say this, teams that are run better than others are not necessarily the ones that spend the most. It's the ones that can evaluate and value, like I said before, when you've got a value talent to get it in under the cap to make that cap useful for a longer period of time. So there's a lot of ways to run these teams. I think the smart guys can always evaluate and value players better than the others. And that is a fact that some can do it better than others.
And I'll get out of here by just bringing it back to the Panthers full circle. I think we had a Panthers play-by-play broadcaster, Anish Shroff, on here earlier in the offseason, and the word he talked about was alignment. And I think that's what you're finally, I think, going to hopefully see with the Panthers going into this next season is alignment between the owner, between the head coach, and between the general manager, something I don't know if the Panthers had over the last 3, 4, 5 years. So let's hope that alignment goes better for the Panthers as they move into 2024 and beyond.
Well, I would hope that's up to Dan Morgan and that he sets that vision. And that takes sometimes meetings after meeting, days after days. But you've got to in order to get that alignment, you've got to show and share everybody what your vision is. And that's really where it starts. And hopefully they've empowered Dan to do that.
And that's a good place to end it. As I said at the top, my guest today has been Randy Mueller, former NFL executive and GM. Randy, thanks so much for coming on the show today, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ryan. Good to be with you.
And that'll wrap up this episode of Inside the Vault, episode number 30. I'm your host, Ryan Smith. Please rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We will see you next time.